Hey, everybody. I'm glad that you are here with us tonight. I am going to try and do something a little bit different, at least with the first few classes of this series, and then you can give me some feedback on whether or not you like it this way or whether you would prefer me just to do video instead of adding in these other elements. But what I'm going to try to do, I built a. Slideshow earlier, and so I'm going to try and kick over and do a. Will it let me? Of course it won't. I have done the wrong thing. Of course I have done the wrong thing. Okay, if y'all will give me a second to stare at this and try to get it to do what I would like it to do, and if not, I'll just give up and... Oh, it won't let me change it. Please let me change it. Well, that's sad. Okay, so here's what I'm going to need you to do. I'm going. Never mind. Forget it. Just hang out with me. I'll skip trying to do what I was going to do, and just do something kind of traditional this week for fun. I'll let you know what I had. I built a slideshow and was going to set it up to do a screen share so that you wouldn't have to look at my face while we were doing this. Instead, I was going to have information on the screen for you to follow along, including a couple of excerpts from some books that have been kind of important as I've been doing the study the last couple of weeks, getting ready to go tonight. But since I cannot convince it to do that tonight, I will just have the slideshow to look at as I talk for a little bit, and you can. I'm sorry, you can just listen to me. If you would like, you can comment or text me or whatever. I can publish the PowerPoint and pop it under the video for you to look at later if you'd like the information in a different format. And next week, I will remember to just start the screen share and not kick my face live at the beginning of class. And we'll try and do it a little bit different next week. All right, cool. Glad that you are with us tonight. Like I said, we are starting a new study from the Gospel of Matthew this evening. I'm excited. I really enjoy all the Gospels for different reasons. They all kind of bring a different voice and a different emphasis to the table. Certainly Matthew is no different in that regard. And I really like Matthew, especially in light of what's going on amongst the community that he writes to and why he writes the way that he does. I think all of that helps us understand what we're reading. And so that's actually what we are going to talk about tonight is just sort of the setting and background and audience of the Gospel of Matthew at the beginning, who the author of Matthew, probably actually was. Well, we don't have any exact... Anyway, we'll deal with that here in just a minute. But that's kind of where we're going to start tonight, is just with background information with what's going on. For those of you who really like history and cultural understandings, you will thoroughly enjoy this. For those of you who are hoping that tonight was the night that we started like chapter 1, verse 1 and began working our way through, that's not going to be this week. We should get to that part next week. That means you have one more week to do what I encouraged you to do the last couple of weeks, and that is read through the Gospel of Matthew on your own. One of the things that I like for us to do, I think it's important, is when you start a book, I think it's important to sit. If you can do it in one sitting, great. If you can't, maybe two. But read all the way through in one run, because when you do that, you get the feel of the book as a whole. We have got a history of like dissecting verses, and we get hyper-focused on a very small piece of it. And you can mine for meaning that direction, but to the exclusion of some other points that you're missing when you do that. And when you read the text as a whole, I think you get a better feel for all of the ways in which it connects, because the book of Matthew is not just a collection of stories. Matthew has a purpose and a reason for writing this gospel, and that's what we'll talk about in a second. First, the first slide you would see if I had my screen share option working this evening, was authorship. And then the very first question is, so who wrote it? Since about the 4th century, this book has been attributed to Matthew, but if you know how centuries work, you know that that's 3 centuries after it was written. It's got a period of time there that's passed before anybody says, we're going to attribute this to Matthew, Levi the tax collector. That's who it was attributed to. It was attributed to Matthew by a guy named Eusebius, a church historian from the 4th century, and he essentially said that this other guy said that this other guy said that Matthew wrote down a collection of sayings. And that's it. And so in the years that followed, people took Matthew's name and attached it to the book of Matthew. There's, I think, a couple of things that should give us pause before we think. I'm not suggesting we change the name of the book. It is the Gospel of Matthew. But before we just buy the attribution and say, okay, well, that means Matthew the tax collector wrote it. One, that's a lot of time to pass for information to be perfectly accurate. There's not a lot of stuff to fill in the gaps. Matthew never signs his name to the writing. We get that perk with some other New Testament books where Paul writes, hey, this is Paul. I'm with these people. We're writing this book. There's no first-person passages anywhere in the book of Matthew. There's no we passages like we get in the book of Acts that was written by the same guy who wrote the book of Luke. And those we passages point most likely to Luke having been the one who wrote it. We don't have any of those in the Gospel of Matthew. And the other thing is, what we have as the Gospel of Matthew is not just a collection of sayings. Like, obviously, if you've sat down and read through the Gospel of Matthew, it's not just a handout that says, and Jesus said this, and Jesus said this, and Jesus said this, and Jesus said this, and Jesus said this. And then there's another thing that I think makes it unlikely that the Gospel of Matthew was actually written by Matthew, who would have been an eyewitness. And that's that he borrows almost the entirety of the book of Mark from Mark. More than 90% of Mark's Gospel is found in Matthew's, often organized nearly word for word. And there are certainly times that he breaks from that word for word, tradition. But if we're talking about somebody who's an eyewitness, he wouldn't have necessarily needed to borrow so much material to fill in. Instead, what I think is likely is that in the time immediately after Jesus' death, the earliest followers started collecting things that they remembered that had been important that Jesus had said. Matthew being one of those who helped in conversation with other followers collect this collection of sayings. And then that was something that got passed around in the early churches that helped form and shape that early community. Mark, I think, had access to some of that. Mark writes down a quick gospel somewhere around the year 62, 63 maybe, before the destruction of the temple, before the revolution against Rome kicked off in Jerusalem. And after the destruction of the temple, the church community, much like the Jewish community at large, is in a really, really confusing and challenging spot. And here's what I mean by that. The temple is still very important to the early church. It would be, wouldn't it? The vast majority of the early church is Jewish. These are people who grew up reading the Bible, knowing the works of God, looking for something different. Many of them crossed paths with Jesus during his time. Some of them crossed paths with Jesus during his time. Many more drawn in by disciples who had been with Jesus in that time period. And that's a dominant Jewish community. We know that there was a leadership of the Jewish churches based in Jerusalem. We know that because Paul, on a couple of occasions, is recorded in the Gospel of Acts going back, talking with them. And we know that the earliest Christians spent a ton of time in the temple. Why wouldn't they? In their minds, they were not starting some new religion. In fact, that's one of the central points to Matthew's writing, is that Jesus is not something new. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise. So they're not looking for things to radically change. They are understanding Jesus in light of their scriptures, their history, and the promise that God has made. And none of those things negate the temple, so the earliest followers of Jesus still participate in festivals. There's a reason they're all hanging out there for Pentecost 40 days after Jesus' death. There's a reason that we see them travel back for festivals like Passover throughout the years. Those are all still very important moments and experiences to Jewish Christians. And one of the earliest conflicts that we see repeated several times in the book of Acts is between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians as Gentile churches begin to grow, away from Jerusalem, and Jewish churches in a predominantly Jewish community in and around Jerusalem and Judea grow there, and there's some disagreement, sometimes very vehement disagreement, back and forth over what is and isn't expected of followers of Jesus as far as in keeping in line with the old law and actions and activities in the greater world. What does it look like to eat meat sacrificed to idols or not? Like, all of those things come into play. So in the year 68, the Jewish people start a revolt against Rome. And for, it started a little bit before 68, but in 68, things go really well for them. Rome has some bad military leadership around Jerusalem. And for like 2 years or a year and a half, they have control of Jerusalem. But in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed by Titus, not the book, the nephew of the emperor. Vespasian starts it, passes it on to his nephew. That's all neither here nor there. And the early church does not participate, for the most part, as far as we can tell, in the revolt. Shortly before the fall of Jerusalem, they leave town. A couple historians, Eusebius being one that I mentioned earlier, said that's another piece of information that got kind of passed along to him, so we don't know it for certain. We're kind of making some educated guesses here. And the church grows and takes a hold in Syria. And so we now have a Jewish church community with a long history that's attached to the Torah, the law, and the temple, and no real roadmap for what faith looks like now. Because these important religious, touchstones are now gone. And in fact, after the destruction of the temple, what you are really left with are two different, but the only two still functional, Jewish religious groups. One is the Pharisees, and the other are Christians, followers of Jesus. And that's kind of it. And so you have this opportunity for people in the church to try and help explain what's happened and how it fits in what God has been doing all along. And that's a real challenge because the temple's been destroyed before. It wasn't what anybody ever wanted to have happen again. In fact, the Pharisees work actively throughout the centuries between these two moments to try and make sure that it never does happen again. And suddenly now you've got these two groups left trying to figure out which direction is up and who has the best understanding of what's going on with God and the world. And so when Matthew sits down, what Matthew is doing is writing to a church community in the middle of this crisis, some of whom, I get the idea from Matthew's gospel, have questions of whether or not God's even still doing anything whatsoever, because Matthew leaves a lot of room for doubters to fit just fine in the community. The Gospel of Matthew ends with a worship service and Jesus' ascension, and some of the people standing in that moment are described as doubting what's right in front of them. Matthew is very good with doubt. Because it's a challenge. Their world has been shot. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Their homes are no longer accessible to them. They're trying to establish a community somewhere away from where they've been. And so what do you do? What does it mean to be a follower of God in the setting we find ourselves in right now? Answer that question. And that's essentially what Matthew's trying to do. Nearly certain that Matthew himself is a very educated Jewish man. Matthew, whoever wrote Matthew, that we're just going to call Matthew going through here, though very likely not the actual disciple named Matthew. Yeah, we did that a minute ago. Very, very educated. He knows his Torah, his Old Testament, very well. He knows the law and the prophets. He has a deep understanding or a deep knowledge of the scriptures themselves. And what he wants to do, what sits at the front of his mind as he writes this gospel to this, exiled Jewish community, this Jewish church in Syria, is an explanation of how God is still with them. And not only is that not surprising, they shouldn't be surprised that this is how it's gone, because this is the direction that God has been working all along. So, Matthew begins with a beginning. He starts with Jesus's Genesis. So we get a genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, and one of the first names we get that is going to be important to who Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And that name, that title, is also how the Gospel of Matthew ends. We come back to that idea that God is with them there at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and everything between those 2 points is an explanation of what it means that God is with them, what it looked like in the form of Jesus, and how it should shape what they do moving forward. The Gospel of Matthew is very concerned with the law. Jesus is talked about as the fulfillment of the law, not the lightest tittle or jot. The iota is going to be missing from the law. Jesus fulfills every single bit of it. He says, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And there are 10, I think that's right off the top of my head, 10 separate fulfillment passages where that's, the direct statement that Matthew makes. This happened to fulfill this. Where Matthew is constantly asking his audience to think about the promises that God has made, the work that God has done, and understand Jesus as a continuation of that work. But I think we have to be fair to Matthew's setting and to Matthew's audience. He's having to write this for a reason. There are some real challenges in the community. They are trying to decide if it's worth hanging on, asking questions about whether or not they've misunderstood, and wondering if that means that they're wrong and need to go back to the kind of synagogue system and the rabbinic Judaism that's developing kind of post-destruction of the temple. And we get the idea, though we can't say for certain, that there is becoming a very clear split between the Christian community and the synagogue community. I think John talks about being put out of the synagogues. Certainly get the idea that there's some challenge that exists there, and that maybe there are groups of Jesus following Jewish worshipers who find that they're no longer welcome in their local synagogues. And so feeling cut off and isolated from a community that's been important to them, that's been a part of their life, that is core to their identity, and has been, central to their religious lives. And what do you do with that? And so Matthew has to answer those questions and talk what it looks like to be outside the synagogues and why that's not a bad thing. And all of these things come into play with what he has to write, how he has to explain the world that they're living in, and what that means for them as people of faith, moving forward. Because they have to live out their faithfulness in some form or fashion in the world as it is. They don't get to change the world and make it whatever they want to be. They don't get to go backwards in time and, ensure that things that they didn't want to happen never happen. This is not a powerful group that gets to decide what happens, in the larger world in front of them. They're living still in, kind of an occupied place and as a minority community. What they have to figure out is what it looks like in their moment in time to live faithfully, and whether or not that can take place in the community that they're in, or whether they need to head to their community of old. And so Matthew sits down and writes why it matters, why they should still believe, and what it looks like to be a person of faith in the midst of all of the chaos that surrounds them. And I think that's why Matthew is still such a powerful gospel. I feel weird wanting to rank gospels in my head. I understand everybody has their favorite books that they really like. I'm not a huge fan of John's gospel. It's incredibly beautifully written, but it feels so very detached. John doesn't focus on any of the struggle or the pain. The other gospels, make sure that we understand that Jesus' death was a struggle, that somebody else had to carry his cross, that he was wounded. John, nope, Jesus carried the cross himself. Everything was under his own power. It was all, decisive, and I think John writes that way for a reason. And one of these days we'll do John, and we'll talk through all of these settings too, about how, John writing 40 years after Matthew to a little bit different setting, has some different things to emphasize, but that's neither here nor there at this particular moment. I think Matthew reminds me and provides welcome to me in those moments when I'm struggling. I've found a lot of hope in the passages where Peter sinks because he struggles to believe in spite of the fact that Jesus is right there. That the disciples doubt in the midst of worship in spite of the fact that Jesus is right there. I like the challenges that Matthew gives as far as what it means to live sacrificially, because there's no longer a place of sacrifice. Now Matthew wants his audience to understand the place of sacrifice is the world around them, and they live sacrificially in the same way that Jesus did. They're not torching cows on the altar anymore. They're turning the other cheek and loving their enemy, and it's costly. Just a different type of cost. So, I guess a quick wind down at the tail end of a little bit of my rambling tonight makes good sense. So what do we have with the Gospel of Matthew? We have a Jewish community that's struggling, and an author that wants to encourage them in the midst of those struggles to hold on to their faith and to understand that what's going on around them does not mean that God has lost or that Jesus was false. And in fact, that they should take a lot of courage from the fact that things went the way that it did. And he's trying to help them understand what it looks like to then be disciples, to live sacrificially as their act of worship. That it's not going to be about rituals and festivals, that it's going to be not in place of, because the law was not about just rituals and festivals. And that's one of the things he highlights from the Old Testament and from Jesus' teaching throughout the book, is that the law was meant to shape you to live a certain way. And so now in this day, that is exactly what has to happen. There are no other options, and there isn't other confusion to be had. They are simply to be the image of Christ, followers of Jesus that live faithfully in the world that is in front of them. And they do so from beginning to end with the understanding that God is with them. And I think that's it's obviously important to Matthew, so much so that he starts in the first chapter and ends in the last chapter with that idea, and everything between those 2 points is just kind of sandwiched between this idea. God's with you, so here's what that means. Remember, God's with you. But I think that's a good reminder for us too. It can be hard to believe, hard to remember sometimes. And we, like Matthew's audience, can get distracted and focused on the things around us that we don't like, that we don't understand, that scare us, that are uncomfortable, that displace us. And to Matthew, that's not unimportant, but it is. It can be distracting away from what actually matters as far as Matthew is concerned, and he wants his audience to understand that. A couple other things that you'll notice that I'll point out as we go through the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew has a very clear image for who Jesus is. He is a new Moses. As important as Moses is to the formation of the Jewish community in the Old Testament, Jesus is more so to this community that they have moving forward, and they're kind of going into a wilderness. That's, I think, an image that gets used there, so much so that Jesus has his own kind of Moses experience where he goes like from call into ministry into the wilderness and then into community, kind of all in one move that feels very similar to the story in Exodus. Matthew has 5 very clear sections in the gospel, in the same way that the Torah has 5 very distinct books that make it up. This is all obviously on Matthew's mind as he sits to write. Those are types, and it was very common in the ancient world for you to try and match types to help people understand the bigger picture of what's going on. And so for Matthew's audience, they have, Moses as this important figure. They have the Torah that is an important part of their lives. And Matthew goes, cool, those are the types that we're looking at. Here's Jesus and his teaching. I think that's an important thing to remember as we read through as well. All right, cool. If you have not done so already, sit down and read through the Gospel of Matthew. 1 or 2 sittings if you can. I want you to take it in big picture style as opposed to getting hyper-focused on some of just your favorite passages. And I think that will be important. Next week we will get into the text itself. And the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew is awesome. And we'll talk more about that next week. Consider that a bit of a teaser. Most people don't think of genealogies as awesome, but I love the one in Matthew, and we'll talk about that next week. Hopefully next week I will remember when we start the video to just go straight to screen sharing so you do not have to see my face, but instead can see information on the screen as we work our way through. If you are interested in PowerPoint-styled information from this evening, please let me know and I'll just share it with you, and then we can figure out I can do a better job next week of having it up on the screen as we go. All right, cool. Thanks, y'all. You have a good evening, and if I don't see you beforehand, I will see you Sunday, hopefully, if you're in town, at our joint worship service with our brothers and sisters over at Sunrise Church of Christ. So we'll see you then.